Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good
My name
morning.
is, good
Good
morning.
morning.
Good morning.
I am Amy Barrett. I'm the Executive Director for ULI South Carolina, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's coffee and conversation with Andy Gowder and Melanie Brown. We are going to jump right into the conversation this morning, but before I wanted to share some Zoom tips with you that will help our conversation go smoothly this morning. I'm going to ask everyone for the first portion of our talk today to turn off your cameras during the conversation part of the program so that we'll just see Melanie and Andy on the screen. And to do that, if you set your Zoom to the gallery view, you'll see our two speakers in conversation, and that'll be a little bit more clear, I think, for the production of the conversation today. Then in talking with Melanie and Andy, I think about 9 o'clock, we'll try to switch to a more conversational mode of conversation. And I'm going to ask people, Robin will put something in the chat to let you guys know that we're going to go to a conversation mode, and feel free to turn your cameras on. And again, with that setting to gallery view, you'll see that nice Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch kind of view for Zoom, and we'll have a little bit of a back and forth conversation today. Of course, like during the entire presentation, if you're not speaking, go ahead and keep yourself on mute to reduce your background noise. And then throughout the conversation today, I want everybody to feel free to use the chat box to share comments and ask questions. And Robin Hargan and I will be monitoring that and helping Andy Gowder and Melanie know when there's some important questions coming through that chat box. So with that, I'd like to say just a word of thanks for our ULI South Carolina annual sponsors. We truly appreciate the continued support of these organizations. Our annual sponsorship campaign makes up over half of our ULI South Carolina budget every year. And so these folks are really important to the work of ULI as an organization, and really instrumental in helping us to further ULI's mission, which is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, who is Andy Gowder. Probably doesn't need much of an introduction with this ULI crowd, but if you don't know him, Andy is a founder and partner in the Charleston, South Carolina law firm of Austin and Gowder, LLC. His practice is focused on land use and planning, environmental and real property law, state and local government law, and corporate formation and governance for profit and nonprofit organizations. Of course, Andy is an active and engaged full member of the Urban Land Institute, immediate past chair of the National Sustainable Development Council, also a past chair of ULI South Carolina, and a current member of its governance committee. So we appreciate Andy and all the work that he does in general, and especially for ULI South Carolina. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy to start the conversation and introduce our special guest, Melanie Brown. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn my camera off, and take it away, Andy.
Great. Well, thank you, Amy, so much. And welcome to all of you. And I see a number of names and faces out there on my Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch screen, however we want to describe it. So hello to all of my friends, and I'm glad to have you with us on this conversation this morning that really will be, I think, a great way for you to start off your day, and a great way for you to start off your Black History Month here for ULI. And just to respond to one of the chat notes before we get started, yes, Matt Kennel, you do look like George Clooney. So let's put that out there to begin with. Melanie Brown, welcome. I won't give you much of an introduction here at the outset, because we're going to be talking about your career and your life history over the next 30 minutes. But suffice it to say, Melanie is a principal and owner of Restoration 52 that is located in Greenville, South Carolina. And although this morning she got up early and braved the cold of Wisconsin, where she is located this morning to be with us. So thank you, Melanie, for being with us. Great.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Andy.
Sure. Well, at the outset, Melanie, you've taken on recently the position for ULI South Carolina of our DEI chair, our chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you want to share with some of our members how you see your role in the work of that position within ULI and maybe the work of the folks who are on your committee?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. First, I would love to start by thanking you for your leadership in this space, because I believe it may have been a year or so ago when you launched and started an internal DEI workforce or task force for ULI. And so I just want to thank you for your leadership in this space and for me being able to be here today. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we think about it in this commercial real estate development field itself and in land use professionals, it's a very homogenous field, right? It's a very white male dominated field. And whenever you have that level of similar likeness, you tend to be more prone to blind spots. And those blind spots then create gaps in the value that we're able to deliver here in this field. And so my goal is, through our DEI work, is to shine a light on those blind spots so that we can collectively create value and close those gaps in the value delivery that we have as land use professionals. I think when we think about DEI and the work, we're just getting started, and it's really in the title or in the name itself. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. So when we think about diversity, diversity is really about representation. And so how do we look at diversifying within our own ULI network, our membership base? So that's going to be one of our efforts, is really around how do we become more inclusive from that perspective. Mm-hmm. Also looking at how can we help support our ULI members in diversifying their own talent and workforce within their organizations. And so that's going to also be some of that work from a diversity perspective. When we think about equity and equitable practices in real estate development, we have done a wonderful job in the real estate industry as it relates to equity in the environmental. So a lot of green and sustainability that we've really put a lot of focus on. But we haven't had much focus on the social equity and health equity side as being responsible land use professionals. And so that's something that we're going to explore deeper as we go on this DEI journey. And then last, when we think about inclusion. So inclusion is really about how are we ensuring that we are inclusive in our development practices and intentional in our development practices as we work with our communities. There's a statistic, Andy, that has stuck with me since I first saw it. And it was published by the Brookings Institute. And it's a report that's titled The Road to Zero Wealth. And in this report, it highlights that Black people across the US, if we continue on the trajectory that we are on, by 2053, we will have zero net wealth. And as we know, a lot of our wealth is created in ownership and home ownership. Right. And so when we think about inclusion in this real estate development space, is really around how do we create an environment from an economic inclusion perspective and right. making sure that members of our community are on that pathway to home ownership. And so we're going to have a lot of fun, hopefully over the next 2 years, as it relates to a lot of the DEI work. So I do appreciate you asking me that question in regards to kind of how I see the DEI work right now playing out right. as we look to form our own DEI internal work group as well, that's going to help support operationalizing a lot of the initiatives.
That's great. And should our members be kind of looking out for some programming maybe coming up later this year on these topics?
Absolutely. Look out for a few things. One most immediate lookout will be is that we're going to send out actually a request of interest. So for members that may be interested in actually leading in this DEI space with us through the work group, we'll have a limited number of seats, but we will send out a request of interest for that. And then definitely look for programming to come for the duration of this year.
Terrific. And I know that you also actually began this work as a member of our recently formed advisory committee. Right. And all of our members may not really know about that and its work. And so if you could maybe share with them for a minute, who's the advisory committee and what is its work?
The advisory committee is a group of dynamic professionals across very diverse industries that's really going to, when we talk about closing the gap in value that we deliver, the advisory group are going to be those individuals that really help to inform us on how to go about closing those gaps in value delivery. And so here's the treat that everyone is in for. Over the course of the duration of this month, we're going to have these coffee and conversations with our individual advisory board members. And they're going to be addressing, so we as a group have been talking about thriving communities. How do you create and sustain thriving communities? Well, our ULI membership base will have the opportunity to hear directly from our advisory board members over the course of the next weeks around that topic itself. So we're going to have some very focused topics for each week as it relates to what does it mean to create and sustain a thriving community. So I would also tell everyone to be on the lookout for that, because it'll be your first introduction to a lot of the ULI South Carolina advisory board members, but also to hear directly from the experts in specific fields that's going to be able to help us create those thriving communities.
Yeah, terrific. And having gotten to know either personally or by reputation a number of those members of that advisory committee, our group here, our committee, our audience here of members is in for a real treat, I think.
Oh yeah.
Well, let's jump into your story, Melanie, because I know from getting to know you, you've got a very compelling story to tell for being somebody who's so young and just on the beginning of your journey, but nevertheless a very important, I think, and insightful journey that you've had to this point. And so let's get started. You're a Greenville, South Carolina native.
I am born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina. And I'm glad you used the term journey, because I use it often, because that's what life is about, right? A journey and things. I'm a firm believer that your experiences in life all connect to a greater purpose, and which has led me into this real estate development field. I've had a very non-traditional, I would say, pathway into this field. And so my life story, or my journey from a professional standpoint, actually starts right there in Greenville, South Carolina. And it starts with the story of a dynamic woman that I love dearly, who's somewhere on this call, and it's my mother. She is my biggest support, and I appreciate it. So shout out to my mother, who I'm sure somewhere is listening and watching.
Yes, I'm looking at her picture right now. So
are you? So she's there. But it starts with her, because so my mother, she ended up getting married at a very young age. She got married at the age of 19, and right there in Greenville. And unfortunately, my father was diagnosed with some mental health illnesses and challenges. And probably around the age of 26 or so, my mother had my brother, and so he's around 3 or 4 years old. My father actually ended up taking his own life about 3 months before I was born. Now, the significance of that is that my father was from the West Greenville area. And so for those that are from the upstate, they're very familiar with the West Greenville area. But West Greenville at the time is an area, older Black community right outside of the city center of Greenville there, that is historically was a food desert, lacked access to a lot of healthcare services, and so on and so forth. But now it's grown tremendously, and we're now dealing with a lot of the gentrification effects. And so that's been a huge topic in the upstate area. But my father was there from the West Greenville area. So here's my mother left with these 2 young children, dealing with a very traumatic event, losing her husband. And so my papa, who raised my father, became the surrogate father for me and my brother. And I remember around the age of 7 or 8 or so, Papa ended up having to go to the Greenville hospital system for an open triple bypass heart surgery. And as my mother, brother, and I were going to go visit him, one of the nurses on the cardiac unit stopped to ask how old I was. Because at the time, there was a rule in place where children under the age of 10 could not be on the cardiac unit. And so I was unable to see my papa at the time because I was under the age of 10. And I just remember crying and being so upset that I wasn't able to see papa. But my mother is the type of woman that really takes the time to explain things. And so she explained to me in that moment that, well, Melanie, the hospital administrators, they create these rules to protect the patients. And next time I would be able to see him. Well, unfortunately, my papa passed away that night. So I was unable to see him in the physical form, but I had a very spiritual experience that still sticks with me to this day. I'm a very spiritual person. And so my papa was allowed to come visit me in the spirit form that night. I remember laying in the bed and looking up, and he was standing by my bedside with his arms stretched wide and this glow all around him. And so I got up and I was able to hug Papa. And then the next morning, my mom was like, were you up? Because there was a light that went by her room. So I knew it was a very real experience, Andy. It was a
Right.
very real experience. But I also was that child that was rooted in, I don't ever want another child experiencing what I just experienced. So when I grow up, I'm going to be one of those hospital administrators, and I'm changing that rule. And so I got really focused at a very young age to go into healthcare administration. So I ended up going off to Xavier University, which is a historically Black college and university down in the New Orleans area. Majored in chemistry and English because my brain thinks on both sides, I guess.
Left and right side, right?
Yes, very much so.
Mhm.
And my sophomore year at Xavier, I ended up doing an internship at the Greenville Hospital System. And at the time, Greenville was hospital system was running like a minority internship program, and they had a chief diversity officer. And I remember him making the statement to us. He said, where we really need you all to be represented is in the boardroom where the decisions are being made, because you represent the voice of the voiceless.
Right.
And for me, it threw me back to my 7-year-old self, and it further confirmed and solidified this journey that I was on to become a healthcare administrator. So I ended up coming back home to University of South Carolina to get my master's in health administration. And from there, that's how I ended up in this cold place of Wisconsin.
Well, Melanie, I'm going to get you to pause there because I just want to remark that when kids are 7 or 8 years old, they want to be astronauts or sports heroes or things like that, and you wanted to be a hospital administrator. So you have been the only one in your second grade class, but
I believe so.
but that's terrific and amazing, really, that stayed with you all this time, and that you came back to that as an older student.
Sure did.
You were confirmed in that vocation, that you were called, right?
Yeah,
so you something pulled you from the warmth of Columbia, South Carolina to Wisconsin. What happened there?
I'm telling you. So there was a postgraduate administrative fellowship opportunity for a large healthcare system here in the Midwest. And so I applied for that fellowship and I got it. Didn't know a single person out here in the Wisconsin area, and decided to take that opportunity. So multiple progressive roles in the healthcare system. And I became the youngest and the first Black female senior vice president for the system. We're a system across 3 states, and overseeing analytics. And this was right around the time when Accountable Care Act was coming out. Reimbursement structures in the healthcare field was really changing to move from based on volume, being reimbursed for volume, to being reimbursed for quality of care that's being delivered and quality outcomes. And so I was running this team of very, very smart data scientists and statisticians, and we were looking across a wealth of data and information, really trying to figure out how to do clinical interventions earlier for patients that were presenting with a lot of chronic disease.
Right.
And what you quickly realize is that no matter what you do, if the patient is within your 4 walls, it's too late. If you're not addressing those factors that occur external to the 4 walls of a healthcare system, such as access to safe and affordable housing, which is like one of the #1 indicators to close life expectancy gaps, access to healthy foods and utilizing food as medicine, access to livable wage jobs, then you're just continuing to send your patients back into an environment that will never be conducive to health. And given my life's journey and the experience that I had with my father, with his mental health challenges and not really being managed well, with my papa with heart disease and his lack of access to being able to access healthy foods and things of that nature, it really made me pause as a healthcare professional to want to move into the preventive space of health,
Right.
actually. And so at that time, I had a decision to make. So our hospital system started to be divested off to other healthcare systems, one being a large Catholic healthcare system out of St. Louis. And
Okay.
so I had a decision to make to either move to St. Louis and work for the national office or step out on faith. And so I decided at that time that it was really time for me to step out on faith and move into that preventive side. And this is where Restoration 52 comes into play. So I had about a 6-month gap or so where I really spent some time with God and listening to the greater purpose that He would have for me to do in this health prevention space.
Right.
And He led me to the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. And in the book of Nehemiah, He showed me where He sent Nehemiah back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall, to restore health and order and peace amongst the people there. And He
Mhm.
was able to do it in 52 days because of all the multi-stakeholders that came together. So hence the name of my company, Restoration 52.
52. Right.
Yeah, because it's going to take non-traditional partnerships coming together to really solve for a lot of our health equity gaps that a lot of our community members are experiencing right now in our built environment.
Right.
So Restoration 52 our mission is really focused around how do we close these life expectancy gaps that a lot of our distressed community members are experiencing, but do it in an innovative way that integrates health interventions directly into the built environment.
Right.
And at the same time, create a vehicle or a pathway for our employers to help solve for our affordable housing crisis. So when we think about our employers and our employee base and our low to moderate income earners, our healthcare systems, which are anchor institutions in a lot of our communities, tend to be our largest employers across any community that you go into across the US. And they have a very diverse workforce. And so why not create a vehicle for our healthcare partners or other employers to come to the table to reimagine how they currently offer their employer-sponsored benefit plans by integrating a lot of these social determinants of health into their employer-sponsored benefit plan. And that would include housing at the time.
Right.
Another big force or factor that those that may be outside of the healthcare field are unaware of is that right now, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, which is the largest reimbursers for a lot of healthcare facilities, they are doing a 5-year demonstration project. And by May of 2023, the demonstration project will end. And in this demonstration project, what they're doing with about 27 or so systems across the nation, they're looking at if you weave in social determinants of health into your health plans, what sort of health outcomes are you seeing? Are you really starting to see a closure in these life expectancy gaps? Are you really starting to see more preventive measures occur? Are you really starting to see chronic diseases being managed well?
Right.
And they are seeing that. So after this demonstration project ends, then CMS is going to look at, well, okay, let's start reimbursing for these social determinants of health. So very soon, housing could actually begin to become a prescription, which then blows up this field in such a way that is
Right.
amazing.
Yes.
So that's the journey that I've been on from a professional standpoint.
Right. Well, it seems so clear and obvious in a way that housing is a component of health and of
Absolutely.
preventative health, but it's not one that is widely recognized or practiced,
Right.
in either the housing field or the health industry. And
Very
so I think it's remarkable that you've put that together and see holistically, the ability to be able to have access to healthy food,
Yep.
housing,
Absolutely.
transportation, jobs as a preventative health
Absolutely.
component or
And doing
prescription.
that with our employers at the table.
Yeah. And how have you found the reception of employers to this idea? Are they receptive to it? Do they understand it?
Very much so receptive. And right now, so in Greenville, I'm starting with a proof of concept project. They're in Greenville, South Carolina. that working with a large anchor institution there to come to the table to help solve for our affordable housing crisis. And so far, very receptive. We are in the beginning, our initial stages of planning right now collectively, but more to come on that. So hopefully I'll be able to highlight, I think it's called Bright Spots or something that we do as ULI, where we highlight projects that are going on.
Right.
So hopefully in the near future, will be one of those projects that can be highlighted.
Well, you can count on that. You need to check back with us as your project progresses, and I'm sure we all want to hear about it and hear how it's going. Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you, Andy. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we are here in Black History Month, and this is you know, one of the focuses of this series this month. Is on race, and I know when you and I were talking yesterday, you pointed out that a lot of what this month is about is recognizing our pioneers, and our trailblazers in this area of civil rights for Black Americans. And you mentioned one person right off the bat. I'm going to let you take it from there.
Oh, yes.
Trailblazer you'd like to feature?
My trailblazer is my mother, Ruby Bennett, actually. She is that trailblazer for me. So my life story, as you all could hear, was one of both trauma and triumph. And my mother, so here she is, left these children, and she had a high school education. She ended up going back to Greenville Technical College. I think at the time it was like secretarial of science degree or something of that nature. She became a secretary for a staffing firm there in Greenville. And she quickly realized that, hey, I can do this for myself. I can start a staffing agency myself and create jobs and opportunities for a lot of marginalized community members. So she did just that. So my mother ended up launching, she was the first Black female there in Greenville to launch a successful staffing agency that she ran for over 14 years. Within the span of 3 years of opening, she had gotten her company to a multi-million-dollar revenue generating staffing agency or firm. So I admire her for just her journey and her really wanting to create a better life for her children. Absolutely. And in that journey of wanting to create a better life for her children, that includes the built environment. That includes ensuring that she's able to move and locate her children to an area where we have access to all of those things, like a great education and healthcare and in a thriving community. And so we ended up moving into the suburbs, the suburban part of Greenville, which is a community called Simpsonville. And Simpsonville then was great, but now it has just grown by leaps and bounds as a suburban community. But when we think about, as we talk about Black History Month and race relations, and as we relate it back to land use, I'm actually going to pull out this book here, The Color of Law. And and I'm sure a lot of my ULI colleagues are familiar with it now at this point, written by Richard Rothstein. And it says on it, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And it really talks about, you know, a lot of the practices and redlining that occurred that really marginalized communities, but helped to set up what I would consider these white havens, which are the suburbs, right? Right. But the forgotten history of how our government segregated America stands out to me, because the very first thing that hits my mind is, well, who forgot? Because when me as a Black female, I'm not allowed to forget that. And so when we think about my experience in the suburbs and my mother wanting to create a better opportunity for her children in the suburbs, my mother's welcome to our new community was for one of the neighbors to come by and knock on the door with some printed out check and ask her, did she drop her welfare check? That was her welcome into the suburban community. And then for me, my experience was I had a best friend across the street, and maybe around the age of 5 or 6, he was a little boy, young white boy, and we were best friends. And boys can be rough, and I was a tomboy. I had an older brother, so I love, we played rough all the time. And I remember very vividly, he and I were playing. I was over at his house, and he pushed me off the porch at his mother's home. We were playing. He was being rough, little boy. And it was a steep fall, so I fell into the flower bed beneath there. And I had injured myself, and I'm out there crying. And his mom comes out, and I'm thinking to myself, here's an adult, she's coming to help me because I'm out here crying. And instead of her coming to help me, she came out there and she yelled a racial slur at me and told me to get out of her flower bed. Now, I had no concept about race relations at the age of 5. I didn't have a concept of that. So that was my very first interaction. And I remember going home and running across the street and crying to my mom about what happened. And I remember watching her. I was looking out the window and I remember watching her go outside and having a very heated discussion or conversation with our neighbors. Oops, sorry, there we go. Having a very heated discussion with our neighbors. And then my mom had to come back into the house and have that conversation that every Black parent of a Black child has to have. And that conversation was around race. So here I am at the age of 5 or 6, and my mother is now having to tell me that, baby girl, because that's my nickname till this day, there are going to be moments in life where people treat you differently simply because of the color of your skin. But that doesn't devalue who you are. And so here I am at that age in the suburbs, in a community that should be a thriving community, an inclusive community. And that was my experience. And I just remember at that point in time, I lost a friend. I could no longer play with this best friend of mine. I was petrified of the house now across the street because of what my experience. And then when you think about fast forward to 2016, when I was living in Wisconsin, my very first home buying experience. So here I am, this successful healthcare professional, and I wanted to purchase a home here in the Midwest where I didn't have to live on top of my neighbors, because up north, all the homes are so close together. And with me being a Southern woman, I wanted to make sure I had land. So I purchased a home out in a village in the Milwaukee community. Can you still hear me, Andy?
Can hear you fine.
Okay. I purchased a home out. Okay, perfect. I had some internet connectivity challenges, but I purchased a home out in the Milwaukee communities in a village here. And I remember seeing one of my neighbors at a Starbucks similar after I purchased a home. And I went up to her because I'm a Southern woman. I say hey to everyone. I was like, oh my goodness, we're neighbors. Hi. And I wanted to introduce myself. And she turns around and she says to me, she says, hey, did you buy that home or are you renting? She didn't say, hi, my name is, or it's nice to meet you. Her very first comment to me was, did you purchase that home or are you renting? So in 2016, it was a stark reality, another hit for me. And then I've started doing a little bit more research about the village I just moved into. And it was established by private developers off of racial restrictive covenants. And so I live in a community, I was living in a community out here in the Milwaukee area where a lot of the homes were inherited. So they're passed on from generation to generation. So that process, that thought process remained, and it played out very vividly for me when I first purchased my home.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, Melanie, that, you know, even though, I mean, those restrictive covenants may still be in the chain of title, but they're not obviously enforceable, they're unconstitutional, but yet the imprint of that in the memory of the people that live there is still there, isn't it? A lot harder to eradicate.
You're right. It's reinforced now in the behaviors because it's ingrained in the thought process and the behaviors now. And so when we think about our responsibility as land use professionals, we have an opportunity to transform communities in a way by being intentional of how we develop communities to be inclusive. And so that's one thing that I hope that we're going to really be looking at is around what are those best practices to ensure that we are establishing inclusive communities so that that 5-year-old little girl doesn't have to have the experience that I had, or that early 30-something-year-old woman doesn't have to have the experience that I had, or my mother doesn't have to have the experience that she had. And so I think we have an opportunity to ensure that in our practices, we aren't reinforcing behaviors that continue to marginalize large populations of our members in the community.
Which really, I think, gets us back full circle, Melanie, to where we started, because I think, you know, the position that you have agreed to take on and the focus of ULI South Carolina, and really all of ULI, is, you know, on this area diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think will maybe start to help us all work on this and be aware of it. But the first step is awareness, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And
Very much so.
recognition. And I think I told you yesterday, I also own a copy of The Color of Law and read it. And it was, to me, it was a revelation and an eye opener, because for somebody just like so many of our friends here that have been practicing in the real estate industry or land use practice for so long, completely unaware of what was below the surface, and what the sort of some of these insidious motivations behind some of our regulations and laws have been, and federal housing policies have been. So I again, so pleased that you have taken on this work with us and are leading us in this. And I know we've got maybe, just under 10 minutes left. And so I see that we've got folks that have joined us live now. We're not just seeing their static pictures. And so I'm going to open it up and see whether some of our members here may have questions for you.
Or comments, everything.
Yeah. Questions?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I just want to comment, if you don't mind. Hi, Melanie.
That's my mom, if everyone can't tell.
Hello, Miss Bennett. How are you?
I'm doing good this morning. I just want to say, as you can see, she is a dynamic young woman. I'm so proud of her in all her accomplishments that she's done and that she's going to be doing. So I just wanted to say hello and just so proud of you, Melanie.
Thank you.
And Ms. Bennett, we thank you for all that you have done in your career and in raising this extraordinary person and in all that you've accomplished in your own life. So thank you. And thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Other questions?
It was always hard to follow mom, but
yes, it is.
Hi, Melvin.
How you doing? Well, I guess my question is, what do you say to people who say, hey, I don't know where to get started when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. I don't want to say the wrong thing, so it's really a hard conversation to have. So what advice would you have on just, getting the conversation started?
Melvin, I appreciate that question because it is, how do we create that safe enough space or environment for people to be transparent and knowing that there's really nothing wrong that you can say because we are collectively moving towards the same goal. And so one of the it is, how do we look for those common connectors? And one of the main common connectors that we do know is that we are looking at how do we diversify this field that we work in? And how do we create talent pools or seek out the talent pools to diversify this field? And so I think starting conversations even from that place, outside of just going on that awareness journey, because that awareness journey is one that, yes, you can do a lot of programming, but that requires a lot of internal soul searching and then realizing things about yourself that you may not have known existed there. So it requires for our members to be vulnerable in that journey. So that is a deeper one to go through. But one of the common connectors that we all do know is that how do we begin to diversify this field? And how can we start to look at ways from a solution standpoint, diversifying and bringing in diverse talent?
Great. Other questions?
Hey, Melanie.
Yeah.
How are you?
So you've come into real estate development from a non-traditional pathway, as you mentioned. What's been your kind of perspective on that industry now? I mean, obviously you kind of knew like people build buildings, develop buildings as someone kind of in a different field, but now that you've kind of jumped into this field, what's been the biggest kind of learning piece of that for you, or what was most surprising? And kind of give us a little perspective on that jump, and your perspectives on the industry as a whole now.
That's an excellent question too, Jeff. And what I would say is that coming into this field, it's a very capital intensive field, right? And so that's something that historically a lot of communities of color lack access to. And then you start to put these mental barriers on yourself around, can I really move into that field? I don't have the access to large amounts of capital. Will I be respected in that field? It's a homogenous field. But what I've been pleasantly surprised by is the openness and the receptiveness of me coming into this field. I've been really embraced by some professionals in this area that have deep level of expertise in commercial real estate development. And there's such a openness and willingness to see this field diversified. And so it was me overcoming my own mental barriers and blockages around my perception of this field itself.
Great. Okay. Other questions? I think I saw Matt Kennel, his hand. Matt, do you have a question? Maybe not. All right. Does somebody else have a question?
I do.
Great.
Andy, hey, I can't turn my video on. I don't know why, but I can't. And it says Amy turned it off. I get it.
Amy's saying no. Amy's shaking her head no.
No, I'm teasing
Diana.
I'm teasing her. Good to see you.
Hi, Diana.
Hey, Melanie, your story is so compelling. I have a question that's sort of similar to one that was just asked, which is, if you had to name just one or two things that we could do as individuals to make this effort move faster. ULI, as probably everyone on this call knows, has been focused on diversity for a long time. And yet we've made not even a smidgen of the progress that we need to make. And so we're hyper focused on it at this point in time. But, I think as each of us as individuals want to add to the progress, but often are not sure what we can do as individuals.
Absolutely. Let me start with what a prominent ULI member is doing with me right now. So I may not have mentioned it, but Bogue Wallen, if you all are familiar with him.
Oh yeah, we are all familiar with Bogue, former chair of this district council.
Yeah, he decided about a year or so ago to go on this crazy journey with me. When I approached him and kind of explained to him what I was hoping to be able to do, and he's like, Melanie, I think you're onto something. And so it took this one individual to open up his social capital, is what we would call that, and his network, for me to really begin to make some traction in this space. And it was as simple as, let's meet for coffee, let's discuss, and then his willingness to mentor me along the way. So that's just something that we can do, and we already do, I'm sure, as professionals. It's just, how do you tap into talent, that more diverse talent? And I think that right now, so ULI is in partnership with Project REAP, which is a program that I recently went through. And Project REAP is an organization based out of New York, 20-year-old organization. And their sole focus has been on diversifying the field of commercial real estate development and looking for the non-traditional pathways for people of color to come into this field. And you go through an 8-week or 10-week intensive course and cohort where you learn about this field particularly, and they bring in a lot of different experts in the field to come in and speak with us. Well, through that partnership, you begin to create a network that you normally wouldn't have access to. And so those are things that we're going to be exploring with ULI DEI initiatives, is intentional pipeline development through partnering with organizations that already have a great footing and expertise in that area. And so it's going to be those things, Diana, that we're going to have to start looking at. Is we can't recreate the wheel in this space, because we don't know what we don't know. But there are experts that exist that we can partner with and become allies with to begin that diversification of this field.
That's terrific.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably, I see we're kind of out of time. It's probably a good place to stop. We could go on a lot longer, Melanie, but we're at 9:15. So thank you so much for your time and for the work you're going to be doing with ULI South Carolina. We look forward to working with you in that role. Yes. And next week, Melanie's going to be in my seat,
the
interviewer And who are you interviewing next week, Melanie?
It's going to be a panel of people. So we're still in. So the panel of people are going to be experts actually in the health field. So
Wonderful.
we're going to be talking about deeper the social determinants of health and how that plays out in the built environment.
All right. Well, stay tuned on, and I'm sure Abby and Robin will be sending out information for that. So stay tuned for that, and look forward to seeing you all this time next week for Coffee and Conversation. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Ms. Bennett. So nice to see you.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Diana.
That was really good.
Yes, I know.
Great start.
She's great,
Start.
right? I mean, I've enjoyed working with her so
Her
much.
stories, I was hoping she would tell those stories, the stories of just not being treated anywhere close to equal, and her stories were compelling, and they always are. The stories always get to me, always make me tear up.
Yeah.
It's just, 2016.
Right?
Gut wrenching.
Yeah.
Anyway, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm all right.
Good.
Hanging in there. How about you?
I'm good. Get my second shot next week.
Good.
Then party.
Hey, woo! Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah. Bye.